Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide an answer for the hope that is in them. According to 1 Peter 3:15, today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue going through Eric Metaxas' book, Is Atheism Dead? Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into multiple languages. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series known as Socrates in the City. He is a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. Some time ago in the Wall Street Journal, Metaxas published an article discussing the scientific evidence for God, some of which we've gone through in this series through his book. So today we will continue looking at some of the archaeological evidence, Part 2, The Stones Will Cry Out, Chapter 14, Jerusalem in Jesus' Day. There's a map of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. You can see where many of the things that are marked in the Gospels, you can see where several of those events took place according to this map. So to understand Jerusalem and Israel at the time of Jesus and to understand the New Testament events, we should give an overview of the history of the Jews until that time. According to the Bible, it was roughly 1700 BC when God spoke to Abraham, telling him that from his yet-to-be-born descendants, God would make a great people. Abraham and his wife Sarah, although very advanced in years, had a son named Isaac, from whom the inhabitants of the nation Israel were descended. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, from whom we get the 12 tribes of Israel. The descendants of these 12 tribes came to live in Egypt, where they were eventually enslaved. So we're retelling the story of Genesis, and now we're retelling the story of Exodus, where it says around 1500 BC, Moses led them out of their captivity in Egypt into the promised land in Canaan. So Jacob's descendants came to Egypt, and Joseph was the leader there, second in command to the Pharaoh at that time. And then that's the end of the book of Genesis. And at the beginning of the book of Exodus, you find that there's a new Pharaoh, and that Pharaoh does not know Joseph, and that Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites into hard bondage, and Moses leads them out of their captivity through a series of multiple supernatural signs, and they go into the promised land of Canaan. So for a few centuries, they're ruled by prophets and priests, and they worship in the tabernacle in the wilderness, which was located at Shiloh. Then around 1000 BC, the people of Israel began clamoring for a king, such as the other nations around them had. And of course, when they did this, they were rejecting having God rule over them. And so they wanted to be like the other nations, no longer separate and distinct like God had called them to be. They wanted to be like everyone else. And of course, the Christian knows that God calls his people to separate from the world and become more like him, and to be conformed into the image of Christ rather than to be conformed into the world. And so Israel fell into that sin that so many in these days fall into. People say the Bible's obsolete and that the stories in it are antiquated and they're no longer pertinent for today. Well, no, you see the same things happening in every generation since the stories were written down. So God gave Israel King Saul, and Saul, of course, was he had issues. Then King David, though he was a man after God's own heart, David had issues too. And then you had King Solomon. Solomon got off to a good start. Got messed up with many foreign wives who led his heart away from the Lord. And Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. But despite the fact that these men were sinful, David and Solomon I'm thinking of in particularly, God used them both mighty ways. Solomon's temple was completed in 957 BC and stood until 586 BC when the Babylonians destroyed it. But the Persian king Cyrus looked favorably on the Jews and enabled them to rebuild their temple, which they began to do in 539, completing it in 516. That sounds like the end of 2nd Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra and Nehemiah when they're rebuilding the temple. Second temple stood for almost 5 centuries until the time of Herod the Great. The story, the Herod, I believe that's the Herod of the New Testament. Yes, the Jesus narratives. An extraordinarily evil figure Herod was, that we will likely remember from the nativity story of Jesus, in which Herod feared that the prophesied king of the Jews had been born and would eclipse him, so he ordered the murder of every male child 2 years old and younger. It was also the result of Herod's towering insecurity that Herod chose to rebuild Jerusalem to a level worthy of his own image of himself, so he imposed very high taxes on his subjects. No expense was spared in building a Jerusalem more magnificent than any before or any since, and at the literal and figurative apex of it would be the all-new temple, henceforth known as Herod's Temple, which would occupy the spot of the previous one. This would burnish his image with the more religious Jews in Jerusalem, many of whom despised him, and would be a monument to himself far greater than any Jew had ever built. But Herod would not only build the outrageously grandiose temple, he would extensively expand the setting upon which it stood, and in an ambitious feat of engineering would convert the entirety of Mount Moriah into a vast platform of 36 acres, doubling its size. The monumental retaining wall built to shore up one side of this platform stands to this day and is the sacred spot where many Jews go to pray. That must be what is the Wailing Wall, and it is the only remaining link to the temple of that time. Most of the stones in this wall range from 2 tons to 100 tons, although one of them by itself weighs nearly 600 tons, or over 1 million pounds. That requires an incredible amount of human ingenuity to move something like that. At that time, the population of Jerusalem was between 100,000 and 200,000, but around each of the 3 holiest days in the year, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, the population of the city would swell to 1 million, most of the people having come to make a pilgrimage, which culminated in a visit to the temple. In the year 6 A.D., Jesus, then aged 12, went there with his parents and many other relatives. Like most at that time, he and his family would have bathed in the purifying mikveh bath of Siloam's pool, and then walked up the extraordinary path just then created by Herod all the way up to the height of the Temple Mount. The temple complex and the temple itself were the wonder of that age, a crown atop for Jerusalem for all the world to see. But the temple was the jewel in the crown, built of white marble and large gold panels standing atop 12 steps all around. It was 90 feet long and 150 feet wide, and had an entrance of monumentally large bronze doors. The historian Josephus claims that they stood a staggering 49 feet high and 24.5 feet wide. The gold and ivory of the building shone so brightly that it was said no one could ever look at it at midday. The interior was covered with ornately covered cedar wood panels overlaid with gold. The floor, too, was overlaid with gold. The expense and splendor of the building were simply unparalleled, such that even the spikes on the roof designed to keep away pigeons were made of gold as well. But the interior of the building was resplendent beyond compare, being overlaid with gold amounting to 20 metric tons, or roughly 44,000 pounds. This is nearly incomprehensible, but Herod cannot be accused of frugality when it concerned the money brought into the treasury via taxation. It is at least a curious fact of history that Jesus came into the world right around the time of this most glorious monument in Jerusalem's history, at least architecturally speaking. Of course, the Jews were under the Roman heel at that time, but architecturally speaking, Herod had brought the city to its highest pinnacle, and Jews who lived in Jerusalem, as well as those who visited from the far corners of the empire, could never have been more proud of what they saw. So we know that Jesus was there at this greatest moment, and that his coming into the world in that place coincided with this architectural and in some ways cultural zenith of Jerusalem and Judaism. Of course, he had been there first as a 12-year-old, teaching in the temple after his parents had long gone home and had to circle back to find him again. That's one of the few stories in the New Testament that we find that records Jesus before his adulthood. When they finally did find him, he rather cheekily said, "Didn't you know that I had to be about my Father's business?" It's hard for us to know exactly how that came across when he said it, but we have to know that there wasn't anything sinful in what he said or how he said it, because as the sinless Son of God, he did not dishonor his parents, as hard as that might be for us to fathom. I imagine him with his half brothers and sisters. Of course, Joseph was not a earthly father, though he was his guardian as far as that goes. But imagine being a brother or sister of Jesus and never seeing Jesus talk back to his parents, never see Jesus get into a sibling squabble, seeing him perfectly honor his parents. That must have been just an unimaginable thing to behold, and to be one of those brothers or sisters, half brothers or sisters of Jesus, to not ever have him sin against you in some way. That's got to be one of the most amazing things to think about when it comes to thinking about what Jesus did during his earthly life, even before his ministry. So they came back to find him in the temple after they had misplaced him, and he said to them, "Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business?" It's hard for us to know how that came across when he said it. There seems to be a wit and profundity in it, which is characteristic of so much he said as an adult. But for him to say such a thing at the age of 12 is evidence that he was hardly an ordinary child. So, it seems likely that when he and his family went there, that they would have gone with other crowds of pilgrims to the Pool of Siloam, pictured below, to ritually purify themselves before walking up the new walkway built by Herod for the pilgrims who came to Jerusalem each year, a walkway which incidentally has only been rediscovered within the last few years, and which was during the writing of this volume been open to the public, as though the past is returning more quickly than we can imagine. But in the Pool of Siloam, in which pilgrims would have bathed on their way up to the temple, is the same pool where 20 years later, Jesus, as we read in John's Gospel, healed a blind man, putting mud in the blind's eyes and then telling him to wash in the pool. The very pool that's recorded in Scripture. But we would not have the slightest idea about its existence if a sewer main had not broken in 2004. Now we're going to look at the story of the discovery of the Pool of Siloam. For many centuries, scholars have puzzled over the reference in John's Gospel to the so-called Pool of Siloam. More skeptical scholars, never being able to explain why he would do such a thing, nonetheless claim John had simply invented the name. But in 2004, the skepticism about this site would be answered when a very large pipe broke that ran beneath the road at the lowest edge of the ancient city. Workmen were summoned up to repair it, and as they dug down to find the ruptured pipe, they uncovered what looked like two ancient steps. They immediately alerted archaeological authorities and soon discovered a large pool with 3 tiers of stone stairs leading into the water. This freshwater reservoir was fed by the aforementioned Hezekiah's tunnel, which we talked about in a previous video. Scholars identified it as the fabled Pool of Siloam from John's Gospel. It was much grander than anyone had imagined, being roughly the size of 2 Olympic pools. Scholars now believe it was the world's largest mikveh bath, and the innumerable pilgrims who showed up in Jerusalem to ascend to the temple would first ritually cleanse themselves here. New Testament scholar James H. Charlesworth of Princeton Theological Seminary says most scholars maintained the Pool of Siloam was a fiction, and that John, in writing his Gospel, was just using a religious conceit. Well, of course, now most scholars were proven wrong with this discovery. There is James Charlesworth. But of course, we've uncovered the actual site itself, just where John said it was. According to the Jewish Talmud, the huge pool indeed marked the beginning of the ascent up to the Temple Mount for pilgrims, so it makes sense that Jesus would have passed by here as everyone did. Because 4 coins were discovered in the plaster of the steps, all from the reign of Janneus, the Jewish king over Jerusalem from 103 to 76 BC. The pool was obviously constructed during or after King Janneus's reign. In their 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem, the Romans wanted to obliterate this vital part of Jewish life, so they filled the pool with dirt, succeeding in their goal for 2 millennia. But thanks to a burst pipe, the site was rediscovered and can be visited today, attesting once more to the detailed historical accuracy of the Gospel writers. Now we're going to look at Herod's temple. But let's return to the larger subject of Herod's temple, toward which those pilgrims wended their way after they had purified themselves at the Pool of Siloam. We must first admit the glorious structure is completely gone, almost without any trace. Not only did the Romans utterly destroy it in AD 70, but even after this, in the early part of the 2nd century, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a temple to Jupiter on the spot, wishing to desecrate what had been there before, and to remake the site in his own image. In the 7th century, the Muslims who conquered that part of the world did something similar, marking their own victory with a monumental mosque, which stands today. Nonetheless, there have been a number of archaeological discoveries that bear mute witness to the place's previous incarnation as the holiest site in Jerusalem. Now we're going to look at the Temple of Herod the Great. We're gonna see Clermont-Ganneau that we heard about earlier, and we're going to find an amazing temple warning inscription that validates the historical fact that the temple was there, which corroborates biblical stories. For example, in 1871, the Frenchman Charles Simon Clermont-Ganneau, who had so recently gone to such heroic lengths to procure the fragments of the destroyed Moabite stone, when we discussed that earlier, Ganneau was in Jerusalem. Inside a school near the city walls, Ganneau spotted an ancient-looking stone with an inscription upon it in Greek uncial lettering. Ganneau read it, and anyone like him who was familiar with the writings of Josephus would have known what it said, what the stone said made the stone an absolutely extraordinary object. The inscription read, quote, "No stranger is to enter within the balustrade around the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be himself responsible for his ensuing death," end quote. What Ganneau had found was the very stone once posted at the edge of the court of the Gentiles on the Temple Mount, beyond which no Gentile could go. An actual stone from the temple, saying to the Gentiles, "Keep out." Of course, Jesus surely walked past this very stone many times with his disciples and must have laid his eyes on this very stone often. Thanks to Ganneau, 18 centuries after the temple had been destroyed, this vibrant piece of history was identified and recovered. Next, after the temple warning inscription stone, now we're going to find the trumpeting stone, as discovered by Israeli archaeologist Benjamin Mazar. A century after Ganneau's discovery, the Israeli archaeologist Benjamin Mazar was just beginning his excavations of the area when in 1968, Mazar found a stone bearing an ancient Hebrew inscription. It lay far below what is the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount, obviously having fallen from that great height long before. Indeed, this shape identified it as a stone that was part of the parapet. This remaining fragment of a larger stone contained the words to the place of trumpeting. Josephus describes the very spot from which it seems to have fallen as the precise station where the temple priests would blow a trumpet to signal the beginning of the Sabbath. So this stone was where Israeli temple priests marked the beginning of the Sabbath. 24 hours later, they'd blow the trumpet from there again, signaling the close of the Sabbath. So mark the beginning and the close of the Sabbath. It's reasonable to assume that Jesus laid his eyes on this stone too, or even touched it. While we can't know for sure whether he could read the Greek of the other inscription, there's little doubt he could read the Hebrew of this one, and almost certainly did. As we've said, it's a remarkable thing that precisely during the lifetime of Jesus, this temple and all of its breathtakingly impressive environments were completed. It's also extraordinary that they were planned and built by the very man who'd attempted to have Jesus murdered immediately after his birth. But what Jesus is reported to have said about this ambitiously impressive temple and its magnificent surroundings is even more extraordinary. In Mark's Gospel, we read the following from chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Quote, "Then, as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here.' And Jesus answered and said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" End quote from Mark 13, verses 1 and 2. Once we understand the unprecedented majesty of what Jesus referred to, we must be even more dumbfounded than we were before. For how could anyone have said such a thing? And why? How shocking it must have sounded. Jesus did not tell them when it would happen, but as we know now, this prophecy was fulfilled less than 40 years after Jesus said it. It's one of the things of atheist skeptics that I don't. What do they do with all the unfulfilled prophecy? I guess they have to discount when the prophecies were written, and fabricate some story that they were written after the fulfillment of the events. That's got to be their tactic. Some may believe the gospel writers inserted things after Jerusalem and the temple had been destroyed in AD 70, but anyone who's read the Gospels realizes that for many reasons they simply cannot have been written after the destruction of Jerusalem. So the prophecies have to have been written before the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jesus' prophecy of the temple's destruction is inescapably extraordinary, but those who would have heard it at the time can only have thought it outrageous and blasphemous. Surely it went a long way toward confirming the views of the religious leaders that this man was in imminent danger to everything they stood for and meant to preserve. And of course we get that from reading the Gospels, that Jesus was a threat to their Jewish-ism and their crooked practices. Another time, Jesus made a statement about the temple that was even more provocative. After Jesus had turned over the tables of the money changers in the temple and chased them out with a whip of cords, the Jewish leaders asked him by what authority he dared to say and do these things. The passage in John's Gospel reads as follows, quote, John chapter 2, verse 18 to 20. "So the Jews answered and said to Jesus, 'What sign do you show us since you do these things?' Jesus replied to the Jews and said to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up.' Then the Jews said, 'It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?' Of course, the passage goes on to say that Jesus was referring to his body. First of all, the specificity that this temple took that long to build is fascinating, since we know it to be accurate. Herod began building the temple in the 18th year of his reign, which is 16 years before Christ's birth, meaning Jesus was about 30 when he made this statement. But what in the world could Jesus have meant to say that he could raise the temple in 3 days? What must those around him have thought of him saying that he would raise the temple in 3 days? Like so much Jesus said, it was almost maddeningly profound and yet simultaneously cryptic too. But we can now understand what he meant. The temple was supposed to be the very dwelling place of God, but Jesus was prophesying that the dwelling place of God would through him be changed forever. The old temple would be absolutely decimated, but the new one would be of another order entirely. And so on the third day, when Jesus miraculously rose from the grave, he created a new way for human beings to worship God. Book of Hebrews calls it a new and living way. Jesus had come into the world precisely so God could cease dwelling in this temple of stone and could instead dwell within each human heart by faith. Paul writes in his letters of the reality of Christ dwelling in our hearts by faith. After all, Emmanuel means God with us. So we could each be a new temple of the Holy Spirit with God living inside us wherever we went. The wealthy religious rulers of that time could not have understood this, nor would Jesus explain it, and so it simply came across as heretical and tremendously provocative. But after his resurrection, his disciples would remember what he had said and understand his meaning. In Jesus' prophecy that the temple would be destroyed, he went so far as to say that not one stone would be left on another. We know that somehow this is what actually happened, but why? Why would the Romans have destroyed the temple to that extent? By way of background, the destruction of Jerusalem during Titus's siege in September 70 AD is one of the most disturbing events of history. The Roman historian Josephus gives us the gory details, but the inhuman cruelty and sheer pitilessness of the Romans toward their enemies is too much for modern minds to take in. Once they entered the city, the Roman soldiers with their swords butchered every single Jew they encountered and set fire to any house with people inside it. That sounds just awful. When it was all over, the streets were choked with corpses and blood. By the time the carnage was over, more than 1 million were dead and nearly 100,000 were taken into slavery throughout the empire. But we should be clear that Titus never wanted Herod's magnificent temple to be destroyed, for he planned to turn this singular masterpiece into a Roman temple. But in the unchecked fury of battle, one of the soldiers climbed atop another soldier and hurled a firebrand through an open window. Suddenly, everything went up in flames. Once he saw this, Titus himself made an attempt to have his men extinguish the fire, but in the deafening crush, and mesmerized to see the flames climb up higher and higher, the soldiers did not obey, and in no time the growing inferno was beyond help. The weeping and wailing of those who witnessed the sublime and holy building aflame was unspeakable, for not only was the work of decades being destroyed in a few hours, but what was inside was being destroyed too. These were the greatest treasures we can imagine. Holy relics from their deliverance from Egypt 15 centuries before, including the most precious Ark of the Covenant containing the very stone tablets upon which God inscribed the 10 Commandments, and the pot of manna they had saved for all this time, as well as Aaron's rod. These were visible links to that time, impossibly valuable and unable to duplicate, living memories from those glorious moments when God did things so miraculous that we still speak of them today. But during and after the temple's destruction, all these things were lost. Titus managed to rescue some of the more valuable objects as loot, including the golden menorah and the golden table upon which the showbread was placed. He hauled these treasures with him back to Rome, and in his victory parade, triumphantly lifted them for the cheering and jeering crowds. We now know that not only was this grandest of grand temples destroyed, but that the dark coda to Jesus' grim prophecy, that not one stone would be left on another, was also fulfilled. The staggering amount of gold in the temple provided the impetus. During the monstrous conflagration, as the dry wood burned and burned, the interior may well have gotten hot enough for some of the gold to melt. But even if it never got that hot, there was so much gold to be had that the Roman soldiers must for days afterward have looked in every nook and cranny of the destroyed temple to find that gold, only too happy to move the giant stones for what might lie beneath them. So that's the end of chapter 14 of Is Atheism Dead? It was remarkable that that somebody could find remnants of that temple and that trumpeting stone. Just remarkable that those things can be found. And it is amazing to think that some of the biblical history took place, and these physical, actual, literal artifacts were present as history unfolded. It's becoming harder and harder and more illogical and less tenable to say that the Bible's just a book of made-up stories. It's just not. It's not a position that can be held reliably. And I think Metaxas is displaying that brilliantly in this book. So next time we'll find 2 more amazing New Testament discoveries in chapter 15 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. So thank you for watching this episode of Blessed Man Meditations. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.